This is a presentation I put together for the 2020 presidential election season. My name is Brendan Cunningham. I'm a professor of economics at Eastern Connecticut State University. My plan for this presentation is just to talk a little bit about sort of the past, present, and future when it comes to economics, with a particular focus on the U.S. economy and sort of where we are right now, where we've been in the recent past, and even further back into the early part of the 20th century, what we're doing right now policy-wise, and where we're likely to head in the future. One thing you might ask yourself is why you might be interested in listening to listening to me as I talk about this topic is and so I will actually talk a little bit about some of the observations I made at the same point, at just about the same point 4 years ago, after the prior presidential election in the United States. So let's get into that, and then we'll move forward to talk about what the U.S. economy looked like pre-COVID, what it looked like post-COVID, up to basically through this year, the policy, as I mentioned earlier, that the government is taking in response to COVID in particular, and as I mentioned earlier, what the future holds. Right, but let's get into sort of go back to 2016 and talk a little bit about, as I said, why it might be worth listening to me. This may come across as a little egotistical, but I think it's important to approach any particular person's presentation with a healthy dose of skepticism. As I mentioned earlier, on social media, in particular on November 18th, 2016, after having sort of reviewed the economic policies of the two candidates at that time, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. After Donald Trump won the election, I made a number of predictions about what might happen over the next 4 years. I made these publicly, well, as publicly as you can, on social media, and as I mentioned in the post here, as you can see, I wanted to be able to evaluate my own forecast for what would happen, particularly when it comes to the economy over the 4 years to come, up to the present day or November of this year. All right, so let's, what was my first prediction would happen? After the election of Donald Trump, I predicted ballooning out of control deficits. Okay, that was the first thing I said would happen from roughly 2017 to 2020. This is a picture of the surplus or deficit run by the federal government. You can see that at the time I made this prediction, the U.S. government was already running a deficit of around negative 3% of our what's called our gross domestic product, which you can basically think of as the size of the economy. In 2017, that declined to around 3.5%. In 2018, it continued to decline towards 4%, and in 2019, the deficit was more than 4.5% of GDP. So I'm going to give myself a passing grade in terms of that prediction. Now, let me just talk a little bit about whether this kind of thing is advisable. The mainstream economic view of running deficits is that you should not run deficits during an expansion, because during an expansion, incomes are rising, people have a lot of jobs, and it's at those times that you should be saving or basically for the rainy day to come, or retiring some debt. And regrettably, on the fiscal side of the house in the United States, over these years, 2016, 2017, well, actually, going back a number of years, the United States has been running these deficits through expansions. And it's basically the opposite of what we should do, and it's been getting worse over time. Notice that I did not include this year on this graph because, well, the year isn't closed out yet, but it would swamp anything that we're seeing up through 2019 because of what's happened to the U.S. economy. All right, so first prediction, I'm going to give myself a passing grade. Second prediction, rising inflation. All right, so inflation is sort of the cost of goods and services in the economy going up over time. Okay, so prices rising. And if this is the inflation rate for the United States as indicated by the Consumer Price Index. Now you can see that in 2017, we did have a spike in January of inflation close to 2.8%. And then things returned to normal, but then we saw another even higher spike in inflation at close to 3%. Then inflation receded, and in the present, it's going up yet again. So, I'll give myself maybe a B or a C on that prediction. We definitely saw a very high level of inflation, particularly in the mid-2018 period of time. That was countered to a large degree by the Federal Reserve in the United States and something we call monetary policy. But we did see a couple of noticeable and significant spikes in the inflation rate. So, like I said, I didn't fail that, but it didn't stay at 3%. So I'll take a few points away from myself for that. Okay, I predicted a shortage of traded goods and services. Okay, so here are two things that did take place over the past 4 years. There was a shortage of IV bags across the United States. These are intravenous bags that you need in, let's say, a hospital or something like that to get fluids or medicines into a patient. And because a lot of these were manufactured or are manufactured in Puerto Rico, when the hurricane was hit there and sort of the recovery was too slow, hospitals found that they were in short supply of these bags. It's not exactly a trade outcome because, when we're talking about basically trade between states in the United States, but it is a shortage that I don't think I had ever seen before in the U.S. And so I thought I would include this here. But there were other shortages more specifically in traded goods. This was an article also from 2018 in which American boat makers were finding that they could not access steel to manufacture their boats, in large part because steel was tariffed by the Trump administration, and so it was much more expensive and much harder to import. There have been other shortages more recently. I think we've all become familiar with the great toilet paper shortage of 2020, which I mentioned jokingly, but there's certainly been more shortages of goods and services than previously seen, certainly in my adult life. All right, next, environmental damage. This chart here shows PM 2.5 levels. Okay, this is a particular sized particle in the air, basically from soot, from manufacturing and also production of energy and power in coal-fired plants and that sort of thing. It actually can have very negative health effects as a consequence of people breathing it in and it causing damage to your lungs. So you can see that in recent years, up through 2016, because of environmental regulation, this soot in the air It was still kind of growing over time, but that growth rate had fallen. And in 2016, it was actually flat, the allowed level of this particulate in the air. But since then, it's been going back up again with, the potential risk for negative public health effects. So that, among a few other things, is an indicator of sort of a decline in environmental quality in the United States. I also mentioned fraud in the financial sector, including fraud involving Donald Trump and his businesses. This is an announcement from December of 2019 in which the president had to pay $2 million under a court order because he and his charity had illegally used the funds that they raised. They were not used for charitable purposes. So a court ordered him to remedy that situation. So it's definitely sort of fraudulent to raise funds for one charitable purpose and use them for something else. And so, myself a passing grade on that prediction as well. And then I'm going to sort of bundle the last three predictions together. Actually, there's a fourth one here, which I'm not going to talk about. But I did say that if the Democrats took the Senate or the House during the midterms, and they did take the House, some of the things listed above might be averted, but I would add a government shutdown to the list, and it is in fact the case that the U.S. federal government shut down after the midterms because the House and Senate and White House could not come to agreement on a budget in time for running out of money, basically. But I will skip that shutdown evidence. As I said, the other three predictions were a prediction of a recession, rising unemployment, and a health insurance crisis. Okay, when it comes to the recession and unemployment, I'm about to say a fair bit about that, so I won't go into details on it right now, but it is true that we had a recession beginning just this year, and unemployment has increased as well. And then even before the coronavirus, the number of uninsured Americans grew by 2.3 million under the Trump administration. So that's an example of a health insurance crisis when people are basically getting thrown off their insurance in the millions. All right, so if you've not studied economics before, sometimes it's referred to as the dismal science. I know not much of that was very positive, but these were predictions I made in 2016, which played out ex post over the past 4 years. And so here we are in 2020, and I'm going to just sort of begin a similar process in describing what might come in the future. But first, I do want to drill down into what the U.S. economy did or was doing before the coronavirus hit. Okay, so the theme I would use to describe the U.S. economy before the coronavirus was kind of more of the same that we saw since essentially 2009 or thereabouts in the United States. Okay, so let me show you, and this is by the same performance. I mean to say that the economy was the same with one qualification. The economy was by and large the same in a statistically significant manner. So this is based upon data. All right, so what I have here is the growth rate of the U.S. economy from one quarter to the next, as measured by real GDP growth. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, I'm looking at the post-July 2009 period running up through 2019, sort of the the last quarter of 2019. Okay, so that excludes, the what we're seeing when it comes to the progress right now. Okay, so what you can see, and the colors here, the green line is the growth rate of the economy from one quarter to the next, annualized, and then the blue shaded region is what was happening with the economy under the Obama administration post the prior recession, which we call the Great Recession. So at the start of the Obama administration in 2008, basically, and running through the start of the administration, there was a financial crisis in the United States. It was the last recession we had before the recession we're living through right now. So I'm leaving out all the recessions here, and I'm just looking at the sort of in-between recession period. And as I said, both administrations basically perform the same when it comes to real GDP growth. All right, it does look like in the Obama administration, there was maybe a little bit more volatility in growth from one quarter to the next. But when you actually test for any difference overall in the growth rate of the economy between the Obama and Trump administrations, there is no statistically significant difference between the two. I think this is a very important point because sometimes you read things implying that the economy has sort of radically improved over the past 4 years before the coronavirus hit. And that is actually, there's no support for that idea in the data. As I said, the economy was basically doing more of the same over the past 4 years before the pandemic hit. There is one caveat to that, okay? So this is a graph of the US unemployment rate between the two crises. The first crisis being the Great Recession, the financial crisis in 2008, and the second crisis, the one we're living through right now. Okay, you can see a steady downward decline in the unemployment rate. Okay, after the financial crisis, a lot of people lost their jobs, and what this graph shows in the blue region was the recovery of all those lost jobs during the Obama administration. The unemployment rate declined by more than 50% over that administration, and in the current administration before the pandemic hit, there was a continuation of that trend. The interesting thing is that actually, if you look carefully at this graph, the decline in the unemployment rate actually looks like it's leveling out in the Trump administration. And statistically, that is true. So job creation actually slowed down during the Trump administration. And to some extent, that has to do with the fact that you're getting very, very close to you're exceeding full employment by quite a lot when your unemployment rate is this low, in the neighborhood of 3%. That was actually a record. And believe it or not, there is a limit to how many jobs can be created because of what's called frictional unemployment, where it takes people time to find new jobs. In any event, the unemployment rate just continued a long-term downward decline over the past 4 years before the pandemic, but the creation of jobs did slow down over those past 4 years, according to the data. All right, so let's talk about what we're living through right now, the post-COVID world. Okay, there's a few things I'd like to present. Now, it's very difficult to talk about the economy in the present because the U.S. economy is roughly, before the pandemic was around $21 trillion in size, And we don't have good measures of all that activity in real time. It takes a long time to study the US economy and figure out exactly what it's doing in real time. But there are some things we get a good view of in real time, and one of those things is unemployment. So this is kind of a continuation of the topic I just started. Okay, so here you can see the very large spike in the unemployment rate associated with the current recession and the coronavirus. Okay, this year we saw the worst unemployment rate in recorded economic history. This data series goes all the way back to the years, the 1940s, when we actually started measuring and recording the national unemployment rate. And in this year, at north of 14%, close to 15%. And there's reasons to believe this is under counted. In reality, it could have been it probably was even higher than that. This is the highest unemployment rate we'd seen in decades, okay, at least a half century. So this is a very, very bad economy. It's a very, very bad recession, worse than anything we'd seen before in terms of its depth. And we're not out of it yet, because you can see that the unemployment rate it's a little hard to see in this graph actually, but the unemployment rate has not returned to its pre-pandemic level. The economy is still experiencing a slump. These gray bars are prior recessions. And as I mentioned earlier, people lose jobs during recessions, but basically we've never lost as many jobs as we've currently lost in the United States. And this is something I predicted back in 2016. I didn't necessarily know that it would be caused by a pandemic, but there were a lot of reasons to believe that the set of policies that had been proposed in 2016 would give rise to something like this. This is another graph where I kind of process the data just a little bit more in order to give some context for what the US economy is doing today. So the first thing I did was I sort of set the unemployment rate to 1 at the start of a recession. Okay, and I did that for the last 3 recessions and then averaged the results. I should say the last 3 recessions before the current one. And this blue line indicates, months into a recession, where the unemployment rate is relative to where it was at the start of the recession. So in other words, after two years after a recession occurs, on average, the unemployment rate is more than 50% above where it started. So this is something we know about usual recessions. With usual recessions, the unemployment rate slowly begins to climb. It peaks late into the recession, and then it takes a long time for it to come back down. The current recession is completely different in its speed and in its depth. So this line uses the same approach. I basically set the unemployment rate to 1 at the start of the recession and then track where it goes relative to that baseline. And you can see that, basically 2 to 3 months into this recession, the unemployment rate was quadrupled relative to where it started. All right. An interesting thing to note, it might be surprising to you that it took 3 months for that to happen, but officially, the current recession actually started in February of this year. So it was not entirely caused by the pandemic timing-wise, but it's a little hard to separate sort of the actual arrival of the pandemic and people getting sick from people responding to it, because if you read the news, you kind of knew this was coming. And so people tend to react ahead of time to risks like that. There's a lot of discussion about whether this is a V-shaped recovery. Well, first of all, we have not recovered yet. The unemployment rate is still at, last measured 8 months into this recession. The unemployment rate is still twice where it was at the beginning of things. So, I wouldn't make any statements about what the recovery looks like until the recovery has actually taken place, and we are still very much in this recession. You might wonder how Connecticut compares. There's good news for Connecticut. Actually, the unemployment rate went below where where it was when the national recession started, and then it did go up, but it went up more slowly than we saw for the country as a whole. And our loss of jobs here in Connecticut was not as bad as what we saw across the country, in part because Connecticut was a net recipient of people. People moved here during the downturn, and that actually counteracted some of the negative effects of the downturn itself, because there was more demand for stuff, and that's good for jobs. All right, now the last line I want to talk about here is this yellow line. This is Sweden. Sweden has been getting a lot of attention for its approach to the pandemic, which more or less was hands off. And it's a little hard to compare Sweden to the US, but the punchline here is that Sweden did experience a recession. There was a loss of jobs throughout the pandemic, despite the fact that Sweden did not shut down. Okay, so you cannot attribute job loss entirely to the shutdown, because Sweden did not shut down and they still lost jobs, maybe not as many and not as quickly. But as I said, the root cause of this is not the shutdown, but it's the pandemic itself. I did want to just talk a little bit more about the impact on the people across different countries, the workforce in essence, although not entirely the workforce, but the population. I just pulled sort of three economies together here. The U.S. economy, we had 668 deaths per million. Sweden, which went hands off, had 586 deaths per million. And I think it's important to note that despite the fact we shut down, we had a much larger loss of life than Sweden, which actually did not do anything at all. Europe had about less than half the deaths per million that we did, 322. They shut down as well, but they ended their shutdown earlier. There was a set of policies which which Europe and New Zealand adopted with respect to the coronavirus, which kept it under control, despite the fact that the shutdown was wound down after a few months. New Zealand had the lowest of all at 5. New Zealand has done a stellar job in managing the pandemic and minimizing the loss of life. And that's really where you want to be in these situations. If you get the pandemic under control, not only do you prohibit the loss of life or prevent the loss of life, you also benefit the economy because there's less uncertainty and people are more willing to sort of resume their economic behavior that they would have exhibited in the absence of the pandemic. This has been very hard for the U.S. to achieve. We still have a lot of unemployment in this country right now, by and large, because the pandemic is still a reality. People are still losing their lives. It's still a risk. And whenever there's a risk, people are not going to spend as much as they would otherwise. Negative impact on the economy. All right, let me talk quickly about policy. There's two types of levers that a government can use nationally in order to influence the economy. One is something we call the monetary policy in the country. And in the United States, monetary policy is carried out by the Federal Reserve. And this particular, this is a graph of an interest rate, which shows how the people running the Federal Reserve are approaching the economy. I mentioned earlier that there was an uptick of inflation heading into 2018, and to counteract that, the Federal Reserve had been raising this interest rate that actually slows the economy down. It's like putting a brake on the economy. So prior to the pandemic, the Federal Reserve had been raising interest rates, and then it had started cutting the rates because the economy had actually started slowing down. And what the Federal Reserve has done at this point is essentially drop interest rates as close to zero as possible. And you can see this was a far more immediate reaction to the present recession than the Fed exhibited in the prior Great Recession, where it took a good number of months before it slammed the interest rate down to zero. So our central bank is basically doing everything it can. There's a few other things it might be able to do in order to help the economy, but the foot is off the brake and it is slamming down on the gas in order to get the economy moving. And it's had some positive effect, but obviously we have not fully recovered yet. The wheels are still spinning a bit. This is a graph of the U.S. debt in comparison to the size of the economy. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. government had started running deficits and running up the debt well before the recession, the pandemic hit. We had the current recession, and there's just been sort of more of that continuing to this day. Taxes are low. They were already cut many months ago, many years ago, actually. That stimulates the economy. That's a good thing for keeping the economy going, for creating jobs. And that's part of the reason why the unemployment rate reached 3%. Spending is the main driver here, though, or one of the main drivers. U.S. Spending, in particular on the military, has been going up at very high rates. And of course, through this downturn, the federal government has been spending on all kinds of things, like supporting households by sending them cash in the mail and that sort of thing. All of these things help in the short run, but they have long run implications because the federal government is basically putting all of the spending on its credit card, and that bill will come due at some point in the future. What's particularly interesting is that the federal government's credit card balance relative to the size of the economy has exceeded 100% for the first time since the World War II and the Great Depression. I think this provides some important context for where the U.S. economy is right now. We're at a point in which the federal government is approaching the pandemic crisis in exactly the same way, or in a similar way, I should say, with respect to borrowing, as it did when World War II was taking place and the Great Depression. So these are historical times, a crisis of immense depth, and there are very drastic steps the government is taking in order to keep things moving along at a bare minimum for the economy. So let's talk about the future. We are going to face, once this crisis is over, a massive debt overhang from these past 5 years. The deficit was already climbing and borrowing was already climbing before the pandemic recession took place, and that only was accelerated and increased quite radically in response to the pandemic. A major problem with this, which I'll talk about later, is that we were already facing a future of potentially burdensome debt, and this will make it even worse. Medical science will bring back the economy, will bring back the expansion, will bring back the jobs once the coronavirus there's either a vaccine or there are better treatments or both, as well as more widespread testing. That's one thing Europe did very well in order to prevent loss of life and return to normal, was sort of a better testing regime. But the mainstream economic view is that there will be no good economy until the pandemic is controlled. When it comes to monetary policy, basically there's no more options left for the central bank. Quantitative easing is one thing the Federal Reserve can do, but going into this recession, its balance sheet was already $4 trillion roughly, which was much, much larger than it had ever been in the past. And for good reason, the central bank is very wary of further increasing its balance sheet. On the fiscal side of the house, despite the fact that we are sort of maxing out the balance on our credit card, we need to continue doing that in order to keep the recovery happening and until the crisis has fully passed. As I mentioned earlier, these are all somewhat short-term issues. There are much longer-term issues like funding for Social Security and expanded access to health insurance, which are both going to be very costly and which have not been adequately addressed and configured for the future. So there will be a great deal of number of challenges over the next 4 years in terms of managing this debt and managing the large federal programs that benefit people in the United States. And it's something we'll need to think carefully about in order to do just right. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I hope that it was helpful and informative. And if you post any comments to this video, I will read them and respond and hopefully that will be helpful. All right, take care. Goodbye.